So last week, if you were here, we had the chance to exchange some wishes, some declarations, some boldness, saying that we are ready for those waters to part, that we are ready for some freedom as we shared the story of the Israelites crossing the Red Sea to leave the bondage of Egypt and to walk into freedom. We decided that we were ready for freedom too, and so we shared with each other what we were seeking freedom from, and we made a commitment to hold each other in prayer for whatever it was that we were seeking freedom from. So I hope that we've all had an opportunity to pray for each other. If you weren't here last week, you're still in time. Let's talk with our friends during fellowship and kind of share what that experience of praying for each other's freedom was like. And if you weren't here, it's still, the perfect time to get on board with a prayer partner who can help you with that. This week we have a new challenge though. This week we're challenged to deeply and honestly consider the reality of God's provision. This week we have the complainers from the children's message. Good job, it included the children. Awesome. We have the all too human and all too real situation of finding that when we encounter freedom, we don't always know what to do with it. Freedom brings its own burden in a sense because it comes with new realities, new responsibilities. It comes with new possibilities. We may not even recognize freedom for what it is. The Israelites are now facing the unknown. Do they even recognize that their freedom has come? They cry out to God in this moment, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the stew pots and ate our fill of bread. For you brought us out into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger." These are strong words. We are starving. We rather had died with full bellies over there than this. What are you leading us into? What is this? We have a saying in my country, "Más vale malo conocido que bueno por conocer." I'd rather have the evil that I know than the good I haven't met yet. The Israelites may well have originated this saying as they turn back with this sense of longing to see that while they lacked freedom, they did have some sense of structure, right? They had some stability. They knew what to expect. It wasn't good stability, but yeah, they were fed in order to perform the duties that were required of them. Jim Curlin writes that, quote, "It took God one day to get Israel out of Egypt, but God would spend 40 years getting the Egypt out of Israel." Ain't that the truth? And can we not identify with that sometimes? Dr. Ellen Davis contrasts the economy of empire with God's economy, the economy of manna. She reminds us of the rich abundance of the Nile Valley, which was kind of an anomaly to the area. Pharaoh's agricultural agents took in so much food that he needed whole storage cities to hold the surplus. And he needed slaves to build the storage cities that held the surplus. We're talking Costco here. We're not talking mom and pop. We're talking mac and cheese back there, all right? So the Israelites built these cities, serving Pharaoh's purpose, until by God's grace, then Israel too started to prosper by this abundance and bounty of the Nile. And we remember that that prosperity and abundance kind of tipped off this whole problem with Pharaoh. That's kind of where it all started. So we're reminded that freedom comes at a price, and part of that price is the price of uncertainty. It's the price of venturing out into the unknown. We know our bondage. We know those things that we wrote on the waters. That's familiar. We don't necessarily know the freedom yet. That is a lot more uncertain. It's a lot more anxious even. It can be fear-inducing in us. Catherine Matthews Huey argues that fear and anxiety, which disable trust, keep us strangely trapped and tied to the systems that oppress all but a few at the top. And we find ourselves identifying with that system, whether we realize it or not. So are we people of Pharaoh, or are we people of God? The economy of empire, which is Pharaoh's economy, is more familiar to us. We might recognize it with the one percenters and all that kind of talk. Typical of every empire, you maximize profit at the very top to get as much as you can and share it with as few people as you can. And you convince everybody that somehow the system is good for everybody. And there you have it. That's how Pharaoh worked it out. God has a different proposal in mind. The economy of manna, God's economy, is the opposite of what the Israelites have been used to. Never mind gathering grain and stockpiling it in silos or Costco's. Instead, we're going to gather what we need and no more. If you try to store it, what happens? It gets gross. It gets filled with worms and disgusting, right? I'm a visual person, so I just picture crawling bread. Ew. How challenging would this have been for the Israelites who've just been going through hunger to realize, I have no protection for tomorrow. I can't take it with me because it will get disgusting. I can't stockpile when I've been used to the stockpiling and structure. And how challenging might that even be for us today to think in such terms? Part of the shift in understanding for the Israelite people, and an ongoing awareness for us today even, is the question of where our food comes from. To the Egyptian slaves, the answer seemed to be that bread came from Pharaoh. And since Pharaoh was supposed to be a kind of god, then okay, that kind of makes sense. Pharaoh owned all those wheat fields along the Nile and took all the grain into his silos, so the bread comes from Pharaoh. But the manna economy rests on the non-negotiable truth that bread comes from God. Always and everywhere, food is God's gift. And Craig gave a perfect lead-in to this with his talk of stewardship, if we recognize that all of these gifts belong ultimately to God. So we can think about food justice issues for a moment. Some of you may have heard the term food deserts. The Food Empowerment Project describes food deserts as geographic areas where residents' access to affordable, healthy food options, especially fresh fruits and vegetables, is restricted or perhaps even non-existent due to the absence of grocery stores within a convenient traveling distance. And typically people would not have cars in these areas. So about 2.3 million people, or 2.2% of all people in the US, if you like numbers, these are terrifying numbers, live more than 1 mile away from a grocery store and do not own a car. That's 2.3 million people who don't have that access. So living in a food desert means that you have limited access to healthy and fresh food choices. And these are disproportionately the poor neighborhoods. These are disproportionately the neighborhoods where people of color live. How do we live into a manna economy as God's people today when only some of us have regular, affordable access to foods that are prepared? Cheetos? Is that manna? Like, seriously? If that's the only thing that you have access to in the store in your community, is that God's justice, really? When it's easier to find a liquor store than a piece of fruit, is that God's justice? Is that God's manna economy? And how do we honor our belief that all food comes from God when small local farmers are hard-pressed to make a living off the land, competing against large companies with genetically modified products that are designed for travel, not for taste, and not for nutrition? How do we honor our belief that all food comes from God when we live in ways that are not sustainable for the planet, where our good food grows like a miracle sprouting from the earth? It's the most amazing thing to watch your own tomatoes grow off a plant. And we don't all have that privilege, do we? Walter Brueggemann finds great spiritual meaning in something as ordinary and as everyday as food. And the source of our food has even greater significance than we may imagine. Because what happens to our bodies, he asks? On the one hand, they take in food. We must eat. On the other hand, that food that is eaten is transformed into loyalty, energy, work, and care. The one who provides the food that we eat governs the loyalties that we embrace, according to Brueggemann. I'm reminded of Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where he encouraged them, saying, "Whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Reminding us that nothing is too mundane, or perhaps we would even say today, nothing is too secular, to be under God's purview and to give glory to God. That is where our freedom lies. As we saw last week, we all have things that we'd like to be free from, whether our desires are for ourselves or our desires are for the world. We want freedom from situations. We want freedom from our own decisions. We want freedom from our own thoughts and from our own misconceptions. Let me ask you this. What if we were to wake up one morning and discover that suddenly there's enough? What if we woke up this morning and decided to turn to God for whatever it is we feel that we are lacking? And what if we were actually receptive to God's response as to whether or not we're actually lacking it? And what if we decided to turn to each other for whatever it is we truly are lacking? And here's the really radical, uncomfortable part. What if we woke up and we realized that we don't need to hold on so tight, that we are part of God's enoughness and that God works through all of us to make it so? And if we acted as if we really, truly believe this, that there's enough to go around, enough financial resources, enough food, enough affection, enough approval and affirmation, enough toys, as it were. And what if we realize that just as our freedom is bound up in each other, our enoughness is bound up in each other? What if we were to decide to live as if this story has not ended? As if this story is still our reality, that there's enough for all of us. Now, I'm not talking about some kind of prosperity gospel thing where I ask God for a Maserati and I pick the color of the Maserati and I have been a really, really good Christian, so therefore God gives me a Maserati. I'm not talking about a Maserati. I'm talking about one of the biggest miracles that God has given us, and it is community, friends. We might even want to call ourselves a church, amen? And we see that now we have a part in applying these lessons that we learned, because these are our stories in the desert of first freedom. God has given us so much, and we've been given the responsibility that comes with our freedom to make sure that nobody goes without their daily manna. The miracles have not ended. We heard about the miracle that was happening at Vaughn's with all that food that got collected. We heard about God's abundance there. The magnificent ways in which we continue to provide for each other continue to rain down from the heavens because we are community, because we are a church. The miracles of hands extended in friendship. The miracles of hours and hours given to a food pantry. The miracle of a cold cup of water given to a person experiencing homelessness. We make these miracles happen. We are surrounded by these miracles. We participate in these miracles. Now today, I'm going to share, I guess you could call it a reverse offering. So it's a givering, I don't know. Yet last time we prayed for each other's freedom. So today we're going to have some baskets I'm going to pass out in a second. And we get the chance to reach in and to grab what it is we need, as a reminder that God's provision is with us and that we are bound together as God's people. And to celebrate that God's grace and God's love and God's enoughness are with us. And as you gather what you need from these baskets, we're going to listen to a song by an amazing songwriter and worship leader that I got to meet at the National Church Leadership Institute. Her name is Andra Moran, and her song is called Little Miracles. And we'll start the baskets going around. Take what you need and share as appropriate.